Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. France on Thursday backed India getting a permanent seat in the UN Security Council as the two countries expressed their resolve towards freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific and said that they were committed towards multilateralism. In a joint statement issued after talks between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron, the two countries supported an inclusive peace and reconciliation process in Afghanistan, which is Afghan-led, Afghan-owned and Afghan-controlled, leading to a lasting political solution. On Iran, they agreed that full compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian Nuclear Programme and the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 was needed to ensure regional and international peace and security, and that current issues need to be resolved peacefully through dialogue. The two nations also vowed to fight against violent and hateful content online as they affirmed their commitment to an open and reliable cyberspace. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the status of Indo-French ties. Joining me on the program today are Pravit Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor, Hindustan Times, Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, former ambassador, and Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, Center for European Studies, JNU. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. What were the key takeaways for you from the Prime Minister's visit to France?
I think it was a reassertion of the very, very close and very substantive and truly strategic ties we have with France for many years now. Even in the, decades ago, when non-alignment was a living entity in our foreign policy, and when we ran afoul of, let's say, the Americans, the case of heavy water for Tarapur comes to mind, France was always prepared to cock a snook at the American superpower and take sides with India. It has followed an independent foreign policy in Europe, and on a number of occasions, many of which have never hit the headlines, but to watchers of foreign policy have been significant. On many an occasion, it has been France that has taken positions supportive of Indian policy in difficult moments, when Britain, the country with whom we've had far more traditional ties, remained perfidious Albion. To that extent, the evenness of our friendly and very supportive relationship with France has been actually far more, let's say, on an even keel than even our relationship with Great Britain, for instance, across the Channel. And as the joint statement says, I think a number of important subjects obviously were discussed, including cooperation in frontier areas, in the cyber world, and artificial intelligence. The Indo-Pacific, of course, came in for mention, but I would imagine that Prime Minister Modi would have referred to the recent United Nations Security Council meeting on Kashmir, which has resulted in a situation which presents us with, for the moment, our most important foreign policy challenge, which is on the fallout of the action taken by the Indian government in Kashmir, which we, to put it very briefly, which we insist is an internal matter of India, and where we know that Pakistan will do everything possible it can to muddy the waters.
Right.
And in that meeting, there was broad support for India's stand, and France particularly, I believe, according to reports, was helpful. And I suppose Prime Minister Modi, apart from thanking France for its support in this meeting, must have briefed him thoroughly on the subject, so that this continues to be France's position, and that France publicly, as President Macron did, publicly sort of enunciates France's support for India's position in various international platforms.
Absolutely, sure.
So I would say it's a significant meeting. It nurtures a very strong relationship and augurs well for India's support within the Security Council's P5.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that having been said, Pramit, so Has France now emerged as India's best friend?
It's coming very close to it. I would argue over the past 5 years, the French government has deliberately positioned itself with the argument to the Indian side that, look, Russia, who has traditionally been, or really the Soviet Union, was your traditional P5, most dependable P5 vote, and overall, power relationship, is now increasingly undependable because of Russia's increasing closeness to China, and the simple fact that Russia increasingly doesn't have any capacities. Its capacities are also reducing. Its GDP is now half the size of India's. A lot of its defense technologies are now obsolete. It doesn't have a lot of the new things that we need. And Russia generally has less and less to offer in terms of economic relationships. There's almost no real B2B relationship, no business relationship now with Russia other than what the governments deal with each other. But really, I think the drift of Russia towards China has put a big question mark about our relationship with Russia. Russia is still a friend, but it is a friend on certain issues. It can no longer be dependent to actually always vote. So issues like Afghanistan now, we are very much on the opposite sides of the fence. And almost anything in which China has a major interest, we know diplomatically Moscow checks with Beijing before anything else. We do have we have a much improved relationship with the United States, but ultimately a superpower like America has multiple interests. And you can never be certain if one interest elsewhere will trump your specific interest with the United States. And we've seen that right now, in fact, with Afghanistan, again, where we're having some differences, but on a number of other issues. Britain, as has been mentioned, has always been a country that goes back and forth, partly because it has always listened to Washington, but increasingly Britain itself no longer has that much global clout. As it leaves, and if it eventually carries out Brexit, it will literally be reduced to a very low level of international influence. So France is interesting on a number of fronts. So France has correctly pointed out that it, unlike any other power other than the United States and Russia, has nuclear submarine technology, nuclear aircraft carrier technology. It is the only Western power really left in the Indian Ocean region. It owns islands here. It has a naval fleet. It has about 1 million French citizens living in the Indian Ocean. In many ways, it is reasserting itself as politically the most powerful country in the European Union, given that Germany, while economically more powerful, has been drifting politically. And Germany, anyway, is reluctant to assert itself geopolitically.
Right.
So on a whole host of fronts, the French are basically saying we can provide a relationship with you on a multi-level relationship, which you used to have to some degree with the Soviet Union, no longer. You could have with the United States if you could make certain that they would stick to one position with India, but which Britain does not have at all. And China is obviously the one P5 country that is openly hostile to you.
Sure.
So therefore that leaves France. France itself needs a larger economic partner, especially in Asia. It is wary of China. Its own economic problems mean it needs an external market for its weapons, for its nuclear reactors. It's also, again, one of the few countries in the world with an indigenous nuclear reactor capacity that we're interested in. So on a whole host of areas, France is saying we're prepared to be that play. And I think over the past 5 years, we've been seeing that slowly develop. And I think Modi buys into this argument. And slowly but surely, we're moving in that direction.
All right. Professor, how has the India-France bilateral relationship evolved in recent times?
Well, I think as Ambassador mentioned, Indo-French partnership has been very close for quite some time. It's not something very recently which has happened. In fact, India today has about close to 35 strategic partnerships. And first partnership was signed with France way back in 1998, and even before that our relations were pretty close. Now since then, all the areas which are really crucial for India, whether this is defense or certain kind of technology, trade, investment, now in the Indian Ocean, maritime security, now cyber security, and many other issues, I think our relationship has really improved tremendous in the last 10-15 years. And another thing which is really very, very important, till very recently, as Pramit mentioned, most of the political leadership in India, and also, in general, everybody believed that, if you really have a very trusted partner of India, which was Russia. In fact, Prime Minister Modi, when he became Prime Minister, when he attended first BRICS summit, he himself said that if you ask any child in India, who is your best trusted friend, and everybody will answer Russia. So, yes, Russia is very important, very close partner still, but there are certain nuances now in that relationship. And one is, of course, their closeness to China, and then there are many other factors. After that, our relations with the US has also improved tremendously in a big way. But now the kind of uncertainty you have in the US foreign policy, now that particular gap is definitely being filled by France, and you really need a trusted partner. The kind of issues which are coming up, the kind of challenges, and particularly as it was mentioned in the UNSC and many other issues. So you really need that kind of partner, which I think France is I think rightly positioned to fill that gap.
Sure.
And within Europe also, their leadership, France is really emerging as a leader within Europe.
Sure.
Now after Brexit, obviously British influence in the European Union is going to be no more. And Germany, which is important economy, but Angela Merkel, of course, is much weaker now what it was, say, a couple of years ago. And France, and under President Macron, they have really taken a lead to even taken over that European kind of leadership, and I think he is moving in that direction.
Right.
So if you are looking for important partner, those who are there in the global scene, those who can help us, I think France can really fill that gap, and this is what actually this whole meeting is all about.
Absolutely.
And this is the strengthening of already things which are already happening.
Sure. So, since we've spoken about the UNSC, and we've spoken about how much support France has given us over the recent past, Ambassador, your thoughts on this whole permanent seat as far as the UNSC is concerned? France has been one of those allies or friends who has openly supported India both bilaterally and even at multilateral forums.
Quite right. Although, speaking of our quest for the permanent membership of the Security Council with a veto, my personal opinion is it's never going to happen. Not at least in the foreseeable, even medium or long-term future, for various reasons. Most importantly, because those who have that kind of power will never let go of it unless they're compelled to do so, and I don't see that happening in the near future. So we are, while we shall continue our quest with the G4, Japan, Germany, India and Brazil, we must recognize that this is not going to happen soon or, for many years, because even the hinterland of each of the members of the G4 is not really united. India is going to be opposed by not just Pakistan, but Pakistan as a member of what's called the Coffee Club in the UN, which is opposed to this whole concept. Brazil will be opposed by Argentina, South Africa and Nigeria are contenders, and there are other spoilers in Africa, and so on and so forth. Plus, if you go in the history of this particular most important aspect of UN reform, the attitude of the P5 has been, while they have paid lip service to the overall question as well as to India's membership specifically, almost everybody, they know that unity is virtually impossible, and therefore they can continue to pay lip service in the happy acknowledgement of the fact that it's not going to happen.
Right.
So, given the way things are, yes, we need, since the Security Council is the only organ of the UN with teeth under Chapter 7, we need friends there. We had Russia once upon a time. We don't, for reasons both my friends have mentioned here, it's not automatic anymore. It's not automatic with any country, but we do need to develop relationships with countries that we can depend upon. And let me say very, very frankly, suppose I was in charge of Indian foreign policy and I had to choose between Britain and France to be my friend in that crucial organ, I would choose France. Given the track record of British duplicity and ambiguity, France every time. So it's not as though France is going to help us in reforming the UN Security Council. That is a subject that will need a complete change in global power balances. Let's see when we become, I would imagine we'll be invited to become a permanent member when we become when we really become a $5 trillion economy with the kind of military and economic muscle to match. But in the meantime, a friend like France, bilaterally as well as in multilateral fora, is something that our foreign policy must nurture.
Absolutely. All right. So, Pramit, taking the discussion forward now, a couple of other things that were spoken about, Afghanistan and France.
Yeah.
Can the two nations, that is India and France, come together and collaborate effectively in the region?
In the South Asian region, the France's limitations are obvious. It's not a superpower. In fact, only the United States still has the actual capacity to function in every single part of the world. Where France really lends itself is going to be what I think the Indian system is already concluding will be the real long-term strategic challenge, will be the rise of or the extension of Chinese power into the Indian Ocean region, which is something we're remarkably unprepared for. And France, as I've mentioned, is the only European power that actually still has a physical military and economic presence in the Indian Ocean. Afghanistan, France was there as a subset of the NATO United States presence, but obviously as America slowly withdraws or reduces its presence to a counterterrorism operation, France is no longer going to be there. But France, for example, one of the things France did agree to do several years ago was that they used to provide weaponry to Pakistan. The entire submarine fleet of Pakistan is French. And partly for a number of reasons, but I understand because of our improved relationship with France. Right now, only one of those submarines functions because all of the others have been denied spare parts. So as a consequence, there is literally no submarine threat, naval threat from Pakistan as of this day, and will probably continue to be for some time. In addition, Macron, you may remember when he was in Australia, proposed an Australian, Indian, French trilateral Indian Ocean agreement or alliance to work together. So he's understood very well that our Indian Ocean strategy, our Indo-Pacific strategy, is something that France could meld in very well with.
Right.
And one of the other areas France is now exploring, and I've met French diplomats who are working on this, is Africa. Africa is increasingly important to us, both economically, strategically. We are now the third largest trading partner of Africa after China and the European Union, having overtaken Japan and the United States. So France, as you know, a large portion of the African continent is Francophone and very close to Paris. And those are the African states, in fact, we have the weakest presence. You may remember recently we announced that we were opening up 18 new embassies, 13 of which were in Africa. The bulk of those were in Francophone Africa because we just didn't have any presence. Right. And France is now saying, those are the places we want to help you build a presence and influence which you've never bothered with before.
Absolutely. So, Professor, talking about the Indo-Pacific, what's at stake for both India and France in the Indo-Pacific? At what level can we see this collaboration and how effective do you see it being?
Well, in fact, in all our foreign policy discussions in the last couple of years, Indo-Pacific is emerging an area in which we feel that, India will have a much larger role to play in the long run. Along with the US, I think as Pramit has rightly mentioned, France is one country which does have a lot of assets in this whole area. So obviously close collaboration with France is going to help us. And another one or two more points I think which are important. What is really emerging in the last few years now, because always we believe that Europe is important, but mainly for economic matters, because yes, I mean, as far as other strategic issues are concerned, European capacities and their interests are rather limited. So what actually we see now, that even in those areas, whether you're looking at terrorism, counter-terrorism, de-radicalization, many of those are kind of issues which are very, very important for India. Countries within Europe are also becoming useful partners. At the same time, another thing also we used to think that there is very strong transatlantic partnership. So ultimately all Europeans will go where the America will tell them to go. I mean, to large extent, yeah, that's true even now. But they are also looking for kind of an independent role, the way things are happening, the way things are developing. And I think this is a very good opportunity both for India and also for major powers within Europe, and particularly after Brexit, to come together and really work for what actually they believe, the democratic multilateral kind of world in which not just only US but even China and others should not really dominate. So there are a lot of things, moving things are happening, in which I think this particular partnership can play a very important and decisive role in the years to come.
Absolutely. All right, closing comments now from all my guests for the best way forward. Ambassador, as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, are there any areas of concern or any areas that need special attention, do you think?
Well, off the cuff, I can't think of any, but even if they do arise, and these irritants can arise between the best of friends, the safety factor, the insurance against differences developing into disputes is the underlying basic, friendly, full of substance relationship. And that I see is very much an evidence with France, not just, as Professor pointed out, not just of recent, emergence, but for a long time. There is, I think, I don't know, there's a sort of a cultural understanding, I think, between France and India that's important. Maybe that's a cause for the fact that the governments understand each other's impulses very well. It's very rare to if you think about it, when I was spokesman, I can testify to that. It's extremely common for us to find ourselves reacting to statements from the UK or the US which we don't like, which display ignorance about some of our policies or a misguided perception and so on. It's very rare to see comments coming out of France which are irritating. It probably it doesn't show that they have a far superior understanding of things Indian, but perhaps it shows that whatever they do have an understanding of things Indian, which the others do also, but before they jump into critical comments about India, they think about the consequences and the very fact that we have this kind of understanding between us perhaps makes them more understanding, more cautious in these things.
Sure.
So France is a member of the P5. As my colleagues on the panel have pointed out, they have, in terms of our foreign policy vision, they have an important role to play. They are a technologically advanced power. And they are a budding power in the Indian Ocean with assets, as the professor pointed out. They are positioning them, they are already a leader in they've always been one of the leaders of the European Union, and if you take Europe as a whole, our relationship, India's relationship with the EU is of course crucial.
Sure.
And today, after Brexit and in recent developments, France's role becomes even more central in the European Union. So there you have it. I mean, you have a situation where relationship with France, developing and strengthening our relationship with France, which is already an excellent relationship, becomes very much part of our foreign policy priorities.
Absolutely. And Pramit, are there any avenues, any sectors that we need to focus on going forward?
Well, I think we already have a fairly large economic relationship, but that can be broadened. The French, officially France has only about $5 or $6 billion of foreign investment in India, FDI. But if you were to actually count money, for example, a lot of French companies raise their capital on the Bombay Stock Exchange or issue, use the Indian capital markets to raise their money. If you incorporate that, you actually end up with about $24–25 billion worth of FDI, which makes France a very large economic player in India. But one of the things that we're really missing, though, is immigration. There's a very small Indian diaspora there. There's still very limited numbers of students. Fairly large number of tourists have now begun in India. The French actually claim that more Indians are starting to go to France and to Britain, though the British have disputed this figure. But on students, for example, it still remains limited, and obviously language is a problem there.
Right.
But that is a link that needs to be built up. And I think, as I've mentioned, that while France has a number of very good technologies, their nuclear submarine technology is much better than, let's say, Russia's. But Russia has at least been willing to give it. France still has legal hassles of doing so, and have yet to break some of those barriers for us to consider moving into the higher echelons of both defense technology and so on. And that's something that I think France should address.
Absolutely. And Professor, close the show with your concluding remarks on where is the Indo-French relationship headed?
Well, Indo-French, I think it's a very bright future, as I think is quite clear. But I think, as you said, where are the areas where we should be slightly cautious? One is, core of this relationship, not just only with France, but with many other European partners, is really economic. So even in the joint statement, I really didn't see much any reference of FTA being a negotiation or something, which they are very keen, but maybe because of certain reasons they haven't really mentioned that. So obviously we need some movement happening in that direction. And second point of caution, yes, they are a very important member of the UNSC. They have supported us and they will continue to support us. But the kind of situation we have now in Jammu and Kashmir, so far things are pretty under control, and they will continue to support you. But they are also very sensitive about any kind of human right violation, any kind of different kind of things developing. So we have to be very, very careful in handling situation in Jammu and Kashmir in the coming weeks and months, because within the European institutions, it becomes very, very difficult for European powers. They are not Russia, they are not America. If something goes wrong even slightly, their support become slightly more difficult for them to justify what kind of support they have been giving to us. So in that sense, I would say one has to be very careful dealing with powers in Europe. But otherwise, the way things have developed, and in particular close defense ties and other ties which have developed in the last 10–15 years, I think this is a very bright future, one can say.
All right, on that note then, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. The panelists are suggesting that the Indo-French relationship is in a good place and the future too looks bright, and there are going to be several areas of cooperation in the days and years to come as well. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.